The blood on Emmett's hands was drying, flaking off his knuckles like old rust. He was supposed to teach the kid poetry, calculus, how to properly steep tea. Instead, he stood in a maintenance corridor slick with gore, remembering exactly why he'd traveled to the galaxy's edge to disappear. The atrium smelled of ozone and crushed mint. It was a sterile, sharp scent that always clung to the upper levels of the palace, born from the massive atmospheric scrubbers humming quietly behind the marble walls. Emmett stood at the smart slate, a piece of old-fashioned calcium chalk in his hand. He preferred the physical drag of it against the board, the faint, dry scratching sound that grounded him. He dragged the white tip across the dark slate, drawing a crude map of the inner colonies. "The fundamental flaw of the Orion trade agreement," Emmett said, his voice an even, gravelly baritone, "wasn't the tariffs. It was the assumption of uniform logistics." Behind him, Isabel sighed. It was a heavy, theatrical sound. She slumped in her oversized chair, her pale, faintly luminescent skin catching the light from the twin suns outside the vaulted windows. She had 4 slender fingers on each hand, currently busy picking at the frayed edge of her denim jacket, a garment she had begged Emmett to order for her from an off-world catalog because she thought it made her look authentically human. Her secondary eyelids, milky and thin, flicked in annoyance. "Emmett, we've been over the logistics," she grumbled, her vocal cords producing a layered, harmonic tone that always made her sound like she was speaking through a subtle chorus pedal. "It's boring. They starved out the rim worlds. People got mad. The end. Can we go back to the poetry?" Emmett turned, wiping chalk dust on his worn corduroy slacks. He offered a small, tired smile. He looked exactly like what he was paid to be, a 30-something human academic with premature gray at his temples, a slight slouch, and eyes that always seemed to be looking at something 1,000 yards away. "Logistics win wars, Isabel," he said softly. "Poetry just tells us how to feel about losing them." He walked over to her desk, leaning his weight on his knuckles. "If you don't understand the supply lines, you don't understand your own people's history. Your father expects you to." The sound didn't register as an explosion. Not at first. It was a pressure wave, a sudden, violent vacuum that sucked the breath from Emmett's lungs and popped his eardrums. The towering stained glass windows of the atrium bowed inward for a fraction of a second before violently disintegrating. Millions of colored shards turned into a deadly, horizontal rain. Emmett didn't think. He didn't execute a calculated tactical maneuver. The old instincts, buried under 7 years of quiet academia, simply hijacked his nervous system. He lunged across the desk, tackling Isabel to the floor just as the air above them filled with supersonic glass. He landed hard on his shoulder, a sickening pop echoing in his own head, his heavy frame covering her slight, fragile body. The roar of the blast finally hit them, deafening and absolute. Dust rained down in thick, choking sheets. Emmett squeezed his eyes shut, his arms wrapping tightly around the terrified alien girl beneath him. She was trembling, a high-pitched harmonic whine of panic vibrating against his chest. "Stay down," he rasped, coughing out pulverized plaster. The air tasted metallic, hot copper and burnt insulation. Heavy boots crunched on the broken glass. Not palace guards. Guards wore soft-soled tactical boots for silent movement on marble. These were heavy mag boots, the kind worn by void runners and mercenaries. Through the ringing in his ears, Emmett heard the chaotic barking of orders, human voices. "Perimeter clear! Move up! Move up!" Emmett opened one eye. Through the settling gray dust, he saw the silhouettes, 5 of them, clad in matte black, non-uniform armor, wielding short-barreled kinetic submachine guns. He didn't have a weapon. He hadn't touched a firearm since he walked away from the frontier campaigns. He was just a tutor. Under the desk, Emmett whispered into Isabel's ear, his voice rough. He tried to push himself up, placing himself between the approaching boots and the girl. A shadow loomed over him. "Target secured," a gruff voice said. The man, a massive wall of composite armor with the name Boyd stenciled faintly on his chest plate, looked down at Emmett. Emmett scrambled back, trying to keep his footing on the slick glass, putting his hands up. "Listen, you don't want—" Boyd didn't hesitate, didn't banter. He stepped forward and swung the heavy steel stock of his rifle. Emmett tried to slip the blow, a ghost of his former training twitching to life, but his left shoulder was dislocated from the fall. He was too slow. The steel caught him flush on the side of the head. Pain exploded behind his eyes. A bright, blinding white flash. The world tilted violently. He hit the floor, his cheek pressing into the cold, glass-strewn marble. Nausea rolled over him in a sickening wave. He couldn't move his arms. He couldn't breathe. Through a narrowing tunnel of vision, he saw another mercenary, lean, moving with predatory efficiency, drag Isabel out from under the desk. She kicked and screamed, her harmonic voice cracking into a terrifying shriek. "Emmett! Emmett!" The lean mercenary slapped a neuro patch onto her neck. Her eyes rolled back, her body going instantly limp. He threw her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. "Got the package. We're on the clock. 2 minutes to local response." Boyd looked down at Emmett, whose vision was swimming in a sea of gray and red. The mercenary raised his boot, aiming for Emmett's throat. "Leave the trash, Boyd," the lean one barked. "Extract, now." Boyd grunted, lowering his foot. "Lucky day, teach." They turned and jogged back toward the breached wall. Emmett tried to speak, tried to scream, but only a thick bubble of blood spilled from his lips. He watched the dust swirl in the empty space where the girl had been. His vision darkened at the edges, the ringing in his ears fading into a deep, heavy silence. He closed his eyes. The chalk dust settled over him like snow. Coming back to consciousness was not a gentle process. It felt like crawling upward through wet, heavy sand. Emmett gagged, rolling onto his side, and vomited onto the ruined marble. His head throbbed with a rhythmic, crushing pressure. Every beat of his heart felt like a hammer striking the inside of his skull. He lay there for a long moment, shivering, the cold of the floor seeping into his bones. The atrium was silent, save for the distant, warbling wail of the palace's emergency klaxons. It was a physical ache in his ears. Slowly, agonizingly, he pushed himself up into a sitting position. He touched the side of his head. His fingers came away wet and sticky, dark blood. He wiped it on his slacks. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. The shoulder was out. Emmett gritted his teeth, a low animal sound escaping his throat. He crawled over to the heavy oak leg of his overturned desk. He braced his body against it, wedged his left wrist into the crook of the wood, took a deep breath that tasted of ash, and twisted his torso violently. The joint popped back into the socket with a wet, sickening crunch. Emmett screamed, falling onto his back, panting, cold sweat instantly drenching his shirt. He lay there, staring up at the shattered ceiling, letting the pain wash over him, letting it burn away the fog of the concussion. He had spent 7 years trying to be soft, 7 years burying the man who had fought in the mud of Proxima, the man who knew how to sever a brachial artery in the dark. He had read books. He had learned to smile. He had taught a lonely alien girl how to appreciate the meter of a sonnet. Lucky day, teach. Emmett closed his eyes. In the darkness of his own mind, a rusted, heavy door creaked open. He didn't want to open it. God knew he didn't. But Isabel was gone, and the palace guards were likely dead, and the local authorities were bureaucratic fools who would spend hours negotiating, while those men sold the girl to the highest off-world bidder. When Emmett opened his eyes again, the tired, distant academic was gone. His face was slack. His breathing slowed. The panic was entirely absent, replaced by a cold, dreadful clarity. He stood up. His balance swayed for a moment, but he forced his legs to lock. He walked out of the atrium, stepping over the debris, his footsteps completely silent. In the main corridor, he found the first body. A palace guard, a young local, his armor punched through with heavy kinetic rounds. The boy's eyes were wide, staring blankly at the ceiling. Emmett knelt beside him. He reached out, gently closing the boy's eyes. Then his hands moved with practiced, mechanical efficiency. He unclipped the guard's sidearm, a standard-issue high-capacity kinetic pistol. He checked the magazine. Full, racked the slide. The metallic clack-clack was a sound he hadn't heard in years, yet his muscle memory welcomed it like an old, toxic friend. He stripped the guard's tactical harness, pulling it over his own bloody button-down shirt. He found 2 extra magazines, a combat knife, and a small handheld diagnostic scanner. Emmett powered up the scanner, plugging it into a wall terminal. The palace network was in lockdown, but the environmental sensors were still pinging. He bypassed the security protocols, a trick he'd learned from a tech splicer in the trenches, and pulled up the atmospheric data. 5 distinct thermal signatures, moving unusually fast, heavily weighted. They weren't heading for the roof. They were heading down, the maintenance tunnels. They were making a run for the lower city spaceport via the subterranean access routes. It made sense. No air support needed. No cameras down there. Direct line to the docking bays. Emmett unplugged the scanner. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. It wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline. It was the violent, predatory chemistry of the human body waking up from a long hibernation, flooding his system with cortisol and norepinephrine. It was a terrifying thing to feel. He gripped the pistol tighter, turning toward the service elevators. The descent was agonizingly slow. The emergency lights bathed the elevator car in a sickly, flickering red glow. Emmett checked his weapon again. Unnecessary. A nervous tick. He holstered it and drew the combat knife. Close quarters in the tunnels. The gun was too loud, too likely to ricochet in the narrow concrete pipes. The elevator doors ground open. The air down here was thick. It smelled of stagnant water, raw ammonia, and the sharp tang of coolant leaks. It was dark, illuminated only by widely spaced sodium bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows. Emmett stepped out. He didn't walk. He glided. He kept his weight on the outsides of his feet, rolling his steps to eliminate the sound of his approach. The pain in his head had faded to a dull, persistent throb, walled off by the adrenaline. He moved deeper into the tunnel system, letting his senses expand. The dripping of a leaky pipe, the hum of a distant generator. And then he heard it, the wet, heavy splash of a boot in a puddle, the faint squeak of tactical gear shifting. They had left a rear guard. Emmett pressed his back against the damp, algae-slicked concrete of the tunnel wall. He was breathing through his mouth, shallow and slow, to avoid the sound of air rushing through his nose. He peeked around the corner, two of them, about 40 yards down the tunnel. They had stopped at a junction box. One was facing forward, watching the dark corridor ahead. The other was looking back the way they came, holding his rifle at the low ready. It was the lean one, the one who had grabbed Isabel. Emmett felt a cold spike of hatred, but he immediately smothered it. Anger made you sloppy. Anger made you rush. He looked at the environment. A thick bundle of power cables ran along the ceiling above them. A large rusted ventilation grate sat on the floor near the lean mercenary's feet. Emmett couldn't just walk out and shoot. They had body armor. A kinetic pistol might not penetrate the plates on the first shot, and if they returned fire with those submachine guns, the tunnel would turn into a meat grinder. He needed to be closer. He needed to be quiet. He looked up. A narrow maintenance ledge ran along the upper edge of the tunnel, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, shrouded in absolute darkness. Emmett holstered his knife. He jumped, his hands catching the lip of the ledge. The jolt sent a blinding spear of pain through his recently dislocated shoulder. His vision went white for a second, a pathetic gasp escaping his lips. Too loud. Down the tunnel, the lean mercenary's head snapped up. "Hold up! Miller, you hear that?" Miller, a stocky man chewing on a stimulant root, turned. "Hear what, Hayes? It's a damn sewer." "Thought I heard a scuff," Hayes muttered, raising his rifle, peering into the gloom. He clicked on his underbarrel flashlight. A blinding beam of white light sliced through the darkness, sweeping over the walls, the puddles, and stopping just short of the ledge where Emmett was currently pressing himself as flat as physically possible. Emmett held his breath. His heart was hammering so violently against his ribs, he was certain the mercenaries could hear it. Sweat stung his eyes, mixing with the dried blood on his forehead. "Nothing," Hayes said, clicking the light off. "Fucking rats, probably." "Relax, man," Miller grunted. "Boyd's already at the extraction point with the package. We hold this junction for 3 more minutes, blow the tunnel behind us, and we're getting paid." 3 minutes. Emmett began to crawl. It was an agonizing inch-by-inch process. The concrete scraped his chest, tearing the fabric of his shirt. Dust filled his nose. He didn't look down. He just kept moving, counting the yards in his head until he was directly above them. He looked down. Hayes was standing right beneath him. Miller was about 10 feet away, setting an explosive charge on the tunnel wall. This wasn't going to be a clean, cinematic takedown. It was going to be ugly. Emmett drew the combat knife. He shifted his weight, dangling his legs off the ledge. He dropped. He didn't yell. He didn't make a sound. He fell the 10 feet in absolute silence, his knees bending to absorb the impact as he landed squarely on Hayes' shoulders. The heavy thud of the landing was accompanied by the sickening crunch of Hayes' collarbone snapping. The mercenary crumpled under Emmett's weight, a startled, breathless grunt escaping him. Before Hayes could even process the attack, Emmett's left hand clamped brutally over the man's mouth and nose. With his right hand, he drove the combat knife upward, sliding it effortlessly into the unarmored gap under Hayes's jaw, angling the blade up into the brain stem. Hayes convulsed violently. A hot spray of blood coated Emmett's hand. The mercenary's boots kicked against the concrete, a frantic, dying spasm. Emmett held him down, pinning the thrashing body, his eyes already locked on Miller. Miller spun around at the sound of the scuffle. His eyes widened behind his tactical visor. He saw his partner twitching on the ground, pinned beneath a blood-soaked man in a torn, dusty academic's outfit. "What the fu—" Miller raised his weapon, but he was too close, and the panic made him clumsy. Emmett ripped the knife from Hayes's neck, grabbed the heavy kinetic pistol from his holster, and threw himself forward. He didn't try to aim down the sights. He tackled Miller around the waist, driving his shoulder into the man's gut. The submachine gun fired, a deafening burst of suppressing fire that chewed into the concrete ceiling, showering them in sparks and pulverized rock. They hit the ground hard, rolling into a shallow puddle of stagnant water. The water instantly turned dark with mud and blood. Miller was strong. He backhanded Emmett across the face with a heavy armored gauntlet. Emmett's head snapped back, his vision swimming, a fresh gash opening over his eye. Miller scrambled to bring his rifle down, trying to point the barrel at Emmett's chest. Emmett didn't block it. Instead, he shoved his left forearm directly into the rifle's path, jamming it against the receiver so Miller couldn't align the muzzle. With his right hand, he brought the heavy pistol up and slammed the steel slide into the side of Miller's helmet. Crack! Miller grunted, stunned. Emmett hit him again, and again. The visor shattered. Miller roared, dropping the rifle and lunging with his bare hands, grabbing Emmett by the throat. The grip was crushing. Emmett couldn't breathe. The tunnel began to spin. Emmett dropped the pistol. He didn't try to pry the hands away. Instead, he drove his thumbs directly into the shattered opening of Miller's visor, gouging viciously into the man's eyes. Miller shrieked, a raw, high-pitched scream of absolute agony. His hands released Emmett's throat to claw at his own face. Emmett gasped for air, grabbing the combat knife he dropped in the puddle. He drove it into the soft joint of Miller's armor at the armpit, twisting the blade sharply. Miller's screaming stopped. He gasped, a wet, bubbling sound, and slumped sideways into the water. Emmett lay there for a long time. The only sounds were the dripping of the pipes and the harsh, ragged rasp of his own breathing. He rolled off Miller's body. He was soaked to the bone in cold water, mud, and hot blood. The air smelled of voided bowels, ruptured drywall, and the heavy copper scent of death. Emmett sat up slowly. He looked at his hands. They were shaking worse now. The human animal had killed, and the chemical hangover was setting in. He wiped his face, smearing the grime and gore into a terrifying mask. He picked up Miller's submachine gun. It was heavier than his pistol, better balanced. He checked the magazine, wiped the mud from the receiver, and slung it over his shoulder. He walked over to Hayes's body and knelt down, fishing into one of the tactical pouches. He pulled out a small, encrypted short-range comms earpiece. He wiped the blood off it and pushed it into his ear. Static hissed, followed by a voice. "Hayes, Miller, status. Charges set? We're loading the asset onto the skiff." It was Boyd. Emmett pressed the transmit button on the side of the earpiece. He didn't speak. He just held it down, letting Boyd hear the slow, heavy, echoing drip of the water in the tunnel. Hayes? Miller? Talk to me. Boyd's voice lost its confident edge. Emmett clicked the radio off. He stepped over the bodies, his eyes hard and dead in the dim light. He wasn't the gentle Tutor anymore. The men ahead had taken something that belonged under his protection, and they were about to learn exactly why humanity was universally feared in the deep black. He racked the bolt of the submachine gun and walked into the dark. The air in the subterranean transit tunnels slowly shifted. The oppressive reek of stagnant water and raw sewage gave way to the sharp, chemical bite of promethium fuel and scorched ozone. Emmett leaned his back against the damp, curved concrete wall, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His left shoulder burned with a deep, sickening heat, a constant reminder of the torn ligaments and the brutal relocation. His hands, caked in drying blood and black grease, gripped the stolen submachine gun. The metal was cold, unforgiving, and comfortably heavy. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a cavernous, subterranean loading bay. The space was a cathedral of rusted iron and cracked plasteel, illuminated by harsh halogen work lights suspended from a vaulted ceiling 50 feet above. The persistent, low-frequency hum of a heavy repulsor drive vibrated through the soles of Emmett's worn leather boots. It was a smuggling skiff. Matte black, stripped of all identifying transponder tags, its boarding ramp lowered like a waiting tongue over the concrete deck. Emmett pressed his bruised cheek against the cold concrete of the tunnel exit, letting his right eye trace the perimeter of the hangar. The adrenaline dump was fading, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. He had to finish this before his body completely betrayed him. There were two men outside the skiff. One, a tall, heavily tattooed mercenary named Finn, stood at the base of the boarding ramp. He had his helmet off, a synthetic cigarette glowing cherry red between his lips. The smoke plumed upward, catching the halogen light. His heavy kinetic rifle hung loosely on a single-point sling over his chest armor. The other, Cross, was systematically sweeping the perimeter of the hangar, a bulky thermal scanner held in his left hand, his sidearm drawn in his right. His boots crunched on scattered loose gravel. Boyd was inside the skiff with Isabel. Emmett wiped a mixture of sweat and blood from his brow, smearing the grim mask on his face. He checked the fire selector on the submachine gun. Full auto. He couldn't afford a prolonged firefight in a space this open. He had no cover once he left the tunnel. He needed to be violent, sudden, and absolutely devastating. He waited until Cross swept his thermal scanner toward the far side of the hangar, putting his back to the tunnel. Emmett stepped out of the shadows. He didn't run, running ruined accuracy and drew the eye. He walked, his steps smooth and rolling, planting his heel first, absorbing the impact in his knees. The gun was tucked tight against his right shoulder, his left hand gripping the barrel shroud, ignoring the searing pain in his injured joint. He sighted on Finn first. The man at the ramp had the heavier weapon and direct line of sight. At 30 yards, Emmett pulled the trigger. The submachine gun roared, a deafening mechanical clatter that echoed violently off the iron walls of the hangar. The recoil pushed against his bruised shoulder. The first 3 rounds took Finn in the chest, sparking brightly against his composite armor plates. Finn stumbled back, his cigarette flying from his mouth, his hands scrambling for his rifle. Emmett dragged the barrel upward. The next burst tore through Finn's unprotected throat and jaw. A red mist blossomed under the halogen lights. Finn didn't scream. He collapsed backward against the hydraulic struts of the boarding ramp, sliding down the metal grate, leaving a thick, wet smear of crimson. The echoing gunfire hadn't even faded before Cross spun around. "Contact!" he roared, dropping the thermal scanner. It shattered on the concrete. Cross brought his sidearm up, firing rapidly. The heavy kinetic round struck the concrete near Emmett's feet, sending sharp chips of stone flying. One shard sliced a hot line across Emmett's right cheek. He ignored it, diving behind a stack of rusted, empty Prometheum barrels. Heavy impacts hammered the barrels, the deafening clang, clang, clang ringing in Emmett's ears. Cross was advancing, firing rhythmically to keep Emmett suppressed. "I got you pinned, you rat!" Cross yelled, his voice thick with panic and rage. "Boyd, we got a breach!" Emmett knelt behind the barrels, breathing through his teeth. His submachine gun was empty. The bolt had locked back on an empty chamber with a hollow click. He didn't have spare magazines. He dropped the useless weapon onto the concrete. He reached down to his thigh and drew the combat knife. The blade was still sticky with Miller's blood. The footsteps were getting closer. Cross was moving tactically, sweeping wide to flank the barrels. Emmett closed his eyes, listening not to the echoes, but to the crunch of gravel under Cross's boots. 5 yards, 4 yards, 3. Emmett didn't wait to be flanked. He lunged out from the opposite side of the barrels, staying low to the ground. Cross, caught off guard by the sudden movement, swung his pistol downward, firing a blind shot. The round grazed Emmett's ribs, tearing through his shirt and shearing a layer of skin and fat. The pain was a hot iron pressed against his side, but the momentum carried him forward. Emmett slammed his right shoulder directly into Cross's knees. The larger man grunted, his legs buckling. They crashed to the concrete deck in a tangle of limbs. Cross's pistol fired again, the bullet ricocheting off the ceiling sparks raining down on them. Emmett scrambled upward, trying to bring the knife down, but Cross was fighting with desperate animal panic. The Mercenary's heavy gauntlet smashed into Emmett's face. Emmett's nose broke with a sickening crunch. His vision exploded into a constellation of white stars. Blood instantly flooded his throat, thick and choking. Cross pinned Emmett's knife arm with his knee, reaching down to wrap his thick fingers around Emmett's throat. "Die, you piece of shit!" Cross spat, saliva hitting Emmett's face. The grip tightened, crushing the windpipe. Emmett couldn't breathe. His lungs burned. The edges of his vision began to tunnel into blackness. His left arm, practically useless from the shoulder injury, flopped weakly against Cross's armor. He needed leverage. He needed an opening. He stopped struggling against the chokehold. Instead, he snapped his head forward, burying his teeth into the exposed flesh of Cross's wrist, right between the armor plate and the tactical glove. He bit down with every ounce of primitive, frantic jaw strength he possessed. He tasted salt, sweat, and then the hot copper rush of arterial blood. Cross screamed, yanking his arm back in pure reflex. The chokehold broke for a fraction of a second. Emmett heaved his hips upward, bucking Cross off balance. He ripped his right arm free from under Cross's knee. With a guttural roar that tore at his ruined throat, Emmett drove the combat knife upward. The blade found the soft gap beneath Cross's armpit, sliding deeply into the rib cage, piercing the lung. Cross gasped, his eyes going wide. He tried to speak, but only a wet, frothy bubble of blood slipped past his lips. He slumped forward, his heavy armor pinning Emmett to the ground. Emmett lay there, crushed beneath the dying man's weight, staring at the ceiling. He spat out blood and a piece of torn flesh. He was trembling violently. The pain in his body was a unified, screaming chorus. He couldn't feel his left arm at all anymore. His ribs were on fire. His nose was a throbbing ruin. He shoved Cross's heavy corpse off his chest with a strained groan. He rolled onto his hands and knees, coughing up dark, clotted blood onto the hangar floor. 2 down. He forced himself to stand. His legs felt like lead pillars. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing the gore across his forehead. He picked up Cross's heavy kinetic sidearm from the deck. It was a massive, brutal weapon, a 6-round rotary hand cannon. He checked the cylinder. 3 rounds left. He turned his gaze to the skiff. The boarding ramp was still down. Slowly, dragging his right leg slightly, Emmett began to walk toward the ramp. The hangar was dead silent, save for the hum of the repulsor drive and the wet drip, drip, drip of blood falling from his chin onto the concrete. "That's far enough." The voice boomed from the shadow of the skiff's cargo hold. It was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. Heavy magnetic boots clanked against the metal ramp. Boyd stepped into the harsh halogen light. He looked like a walking dreadnought. His heavy combat armor was thick with reactive plating, scarred and pitted from countless frontier skirmishes. In his right hand, he held a massive automatic shotgun, the barrel resting casually against his hip. In his left hand, suspended by the collar of her ruined denim jacket, was Isabel. Her feet dangled inches off the deck. She was conscious, but barely. Her pale 4-fingered hands weakly clawed at Boyd's massive armored wrist. Her milky secondary eyelids flickered rapidly in terror. When she saw Emmett, her eyes widened. She didn't see the gentle academic who corrected her posture and patiently explained the nuances of human tariffs. She saw a nightmare, a man soaked in gore, his clothes torn to rags, his face a swollen, bloody mask of primitive violence. "Emmett!" she choked out, her harmonic voice a fragile, broken whisper. Boyd looked at the bodies of Finn and Cross, then looked at Emmett. A low, rumbling chuckle vibrated in the mercenary's chest. "Well, I'll be damned," Boyd said, shaking his head. "The Tutor. I should have caved your skull in when I had the chance in the atrium. Who the hell are you? You ain't no school teacher." Emmett stopped at the base of the ramp. He stood 10 feet away from the giant. He didn't raise the hand cannon. He just let it hang by his side. His breathing was a harsh, ragged rasp. "Let the girl go, Boyd," Emmett said. His voice didn't sound like his own. It was a dry, hollow scrape, like 2 stones grinding together. "Or what?" Boyd sneered, lifting his shotgun. "You're bleeding out, pal. You look like you're about to fall over. You took out my boys. Impressive. Really? But you're out of your weight class now. I'm taking the alien payout, and I'm leaving you here to rot." "The logistics," Emmett rasped, swaying slightly on his feet, "were flawed." Boyd frowned. "What the fuck are you talking about?" "You assumed uniform resistance," Emmett said, his dead eyes locking onto Boyd's visor. "You assumed a soft target. You didn't do the math on the local variables." Boyd's face hardened. He raised the shotgun, aiming it squarely at Emmett's chest. "Math class is over. Teach." Emmett didn't dive for cover. He didn't try to outdraw the shotgun. His body was too broken, too slow. He knew he couldn't beat Boyd's reflexes. Instead, he raised the heavy hand cannon and pointed it straight down at the metal deck between Boyd's boots. He pulled the trigger. The heavy kinetic round struck the reinforced plasteel grating of the ramp. It didn't penetrate. It shattered. But Emmett wasn't aiming to penetrate the deck. He was aiming for the high-pressure hydraulic line running directly beneath the grating, the line that controlled the skiff's heavy cargo locks. The bullet sheared through the pressurized casing. With an ear-splitting shriek, highly compressed, scalding hydraulic fluid erupted from the grating in a blinding geyser-like spray. The white-hot liquid blasted upward at 1,000 pounds per square inch, catching Boyd squarely under the chin, where his heavy chest plate met his helmet. Boyd roared in agony. The scalding fluid blinded him, melting through the soft seals of his armor, cooking his skin instantly. He dropped Isabel, dropping the shotgun, his massive hands clawing frantically at his own helmet, trying to rip it off. Emmett didn't hesitate. He dropped the hand cannon. He pushed off his back foot, fighting through the blinding agony in his leg, and tackled the blinded giant. They crashed backward onto the metal grating of the ramp. Boyd was a massive wall of muscle and armor, but he was thrashing wildly, screaming as the hydraulic fluid seared his face. Emmett climbed onto the man's chest. He didn't have his knife. He didn't have a gun. He had only his bare hands. He drove his right fist into the ruined seals of Boyd's helmet. His knuckles split open against the plasteel, but he didn't stop. He hit him again. And again. He was operating on pure, localized, prehistoric